I'm known these days as a conduit between Indigenous and Western world. I find myself, I have a role to play standing on one foot into the other. As I was growing up, I got in trouble in the neighborhood. Even my first experience going to school was run by nuns. And this is a law that's been around since 1887, that every child from the age of 5 to the age of 16 must attend these schools, the Indian residential schools. It was about elimination of identity, including your languages, your worldview, everything that made you strong. And I remember getting my hands strapped by the head nun almost on a daily basis for things that I did or didn't do. I was 5 years old. Because essentially, I have learned how to accept pain. Pain was just part of life. Now, in 1970, they revised this Indian Act to allow parents, or grandparents in this case, to raise a child in their home. There was such a tremendous need to get to know the Indigenous peoples. At the same time, our own people need to learn about their own history because they weren't taught this in schools. It was only in the last 15 years. The focus now is to introduce that as a curriculum in our schools. So that's where we are with it. So when you asked me the original question about contemporary, traditional, I am very much both.
This is the Gifts of Trauma podcast. Stories of transformation and healing through compassionate inquiry. Welcome to the Gifts of Trauma podcast. I'm Rosemary Davies-Janes, and today I'm speaking with Allen Sutherland. Welcome, Allen. I've been looking forward to this conversation as there's so much I'd like to learn about you, your work, your community, and the trauma that you're supporting Indigenous people in healing.
Glad to be here.
Allen, I'll start your introduction myself, and then I'm going to invite you to take over.
Yes.
You're an esteemed Anishinaabe Elder, traditional knowledge keeper, healer, and historian whose work in the public has made a generational difference in Canada. Now, Allen, what else would you like to say to introduce yourself to our listeners?
I'll introduce myself in my language. Wapshki menesezik meseten lisnakas. Pijuni no dem, ishkonani no di. No, Anishinaabe ni. What I just said is that White Spotted Horse is my spirit name. From the Lynx clan, Skowhegan First Nation of Treaty 2 territory here in Canada. And I'm Anishinaabe. But you can call me Allen Sutherland. That's my common English name.
Thank you, Allen. Anything else you'd like to say about the work you do? Anything to introduce yourself?
Oh gosh, as we finish off 2024 and this full moon that we recently had, it's about reflection of who we are, our journey that we have taken as we look towards 2025. And there's a lot of reflection for me. What more can I do to contribute not only to myself, my family, my community, but my country, the world? And I've been doing as a historian, as a knowledge keeper, and now recently as an elder. I reflect back that a lot of my work's been 25 years now when it comes to getting to have Canadians, Manitobans, or our people to understand the impact of colonization, especially in the history of Canada. But its impact is felt around the world. So I've been reflecting on who I am. I live this history. I came into this history where they weren't even teaching who we are as peoples of Canada. And the thing about it was they not only not teach this in schools, but Canadians or new Canadians never knew it existed. And the thing is, our identity was really much taken away because I grew up being called an Indian, which is a colonial word for new peoples that are discovered. Historically, we had East Indian, West Indian, because we look similar or in our color. So that there is a lot of that was something that I lived through, and I wanted to know why it happened.
Yeah, that's a very good question. And you are absolutely right. I was born in Canada, and I did not know about the residential schools
Hmm.
in Canada. However, I grew up in Australia, and I knew it happened to the Aboriginal people there. It's astonishing because it was many generations that the Indigenous schools existed in Canada. Can you walk us through back to when that started?
I almost weekly, when I speak to groups, I would talk about this two worldviews of Canada. And one worldview, is, as I get into it, is the Indigenous worldview that talks about our identity, who we are. And it goes back to we had these four spirits that was lowered to the earth, or Manitou Gitigan is the earth garden. And these four will have their own places to eventually evolve and grow, and they become many peoples of the world. So these are these four colors that represents that: the yellow and the white and the black and eventually the red. So I would go into the origin stories of Indigenous people in terms of what was like as survivor societies prior to contact with Christopher Columbus 500 years ago. And then I'll go and talk about world events that took place on the other side of the world, from the likes of the times of Roman Empire and the Roman Catholic Church, and that these European laws that eventually, from the 13th century, became laws that will eventually have a tremendous impact on the world. And then later on, they come over on our side of the garden and they started taking over. They felt that our worldview doesn't work with their worldview because we see everything as one. We see that greater is than everything. But try to explain that 500 years ago, when they don't believe that there's spirit in the trees and the water, even in your dog Fido, there's no such thing. But they teach this now in schools because now they call it energy. We say Manitou, but they call it energy, and everything, energies and everything. So, but it was slow in the making.
Yeah.
In terms to understand each other's worldview. We were bombarded with one worldview, but they never got to know who we are.
It was all one directional. It was all coming, telling, but never asking.
That's right. It wasn't that way in the beginning. There was a period, we call it a golden age of the fur trade. They were very much in the minority. They're showing up, didn't know how to shelter themselves, didn't know how to feed themselves. And through the Anishinaabe generosity of people of the kind heart, always helped out. There was over 250 years of getting to know each other, but more and more people were showing up all the time. Next thing you know it, because the European disease like influenza, smallpox, it devastated the landscape. Now we're no longer the majority, but we're struggling. We're still in large numbers, but we are struggling with the advent of these. The world is changing all around us. But I'll just make this one point. Canada has a unique history that it buried for so long. Canada did not become a country through the means of battles, or warfare, or buying. They asked, can we live with you? And that's from the days of the newcomers coming in the form of setting up trading posts, but eventually more and more are coming and they ask, can we live with you? So there was this arrangement through treaties that says, yes, let's live together. That created the foundation of what we call Canada today, to create the second largest landmass country in the world from coast to coast. not through a means of conflict. It was a mean of sharing. But as Canadians are able to create their own British North American Act, getting permission from Queen Victoria that we wish to be a country too, and that became the Dominion of Canada. So even though they were making treaties, their intent was not to share. So 5 years later, they created the Indian Act, which is the same model that many countries have borrowed from, such as South Africa, into apartheid. They use the same policies and how you overcome a country using laws. That's where it went wrong. 5 years after Confederacy, they started saying that we are the ones that are charged over you and your lands, and they ignored their treaty obligations.
Thank you for that history, Alan. I'm actually speaking to you from South Africa right now.
Okay.
And I'm very aware of the two worldviews because there is the history, the colonial history that is taught in schools, and then the actual history that is ignored. But I'm smiling a little bit as I say this, but it's not a happy smile. It's ironic. And I guess where the architects of apartheid missed the boat was they didn't realize they shouldn't go public with the oppression that they were inflicting on the majority of the population. And that seems to be what Canada did so well for so long, because the apartheid only existed for less than half a century, whereas the oppression in Canada went on and on. So, and you see this repeated all over the world, wherever colonizers moved in, however they got their hands on a territory that didn't belong to them, whether it was through trading, as you just described, or through warfare, or through battle. Yeah, it's pretty much a global event. Would you like to say anything about the commonalities of the approach between different colonized nations or regions?
Like I said earlier, it started with a pope that basically, to protect the pilgrimages that were going to the Middle East with the Crusaders, they made a law that essentially says, if you find resistance of any kind, especially if they're pagans or heathens, uncivilized, you can defend yourself, or to protect yourself, you create laws over them. So that became eventually other laws that go on top of that have impacted the rest of the world. Even in Canada, from Christopher Columbus to Cabot on the East Coast, that all you have to do is be sanctioned by a kingdom or king or queen, and then you got a charter, and you read out the charter that on behalf of your king or queen, I proclaim or I take over these lands and everything on it. So it's a little ritual. Just plant your cross, plant your flag, say the words, big bang boom, shazam, whatever words you want to make magic with. It is now owned by the European kingdom. And guess what? This went everywhere.
Yes, it did. That was a very avaricious time. Lots of people taking their piece of the colonial pie all over the world. So a very dark time for many Indigenous peoples. So that leads me to a question. Can you tell us about your role as a connection between traditional and contemporary worlds, or perhaps share a story of how that plays out?
Okay. Yeah, I'm known these days as a conduit between Indigenous and Western world. I find myself, I have a role to play standing one foot into the other. And I'll explain this to you. This is growing up in a semi-isolated community called Scout First Nation that had only one road in, surrounded by beautiful lakes and rivers. And the agricultural belt, it was essentially 15 miles away. But I grew up in a community of less than 400 people. And we were very much living the life with our ancestors. We're survivor society. My grandfather had cattle that he looked after. My grandmother had her garden. My grandfather was a fisherman, commercial fisherman, a hunter, trapper. And we had growing up, initially didn't have electricity. We lived in a cabin. Now, what really, when I reflect on my life, was I initially was born in Winnipeg, a city that was 3.5 hours away, and lived in the inner city, which is the poorest places you could live in, or the end of Winnipeg. As I was growing up, I got in trouble in the neighborhood. Even my first experience going to school was run by nuns. And I remember getting my hands strapped by the head nun almost on a daily basis for things that I did or didn't do. But this is going to be the topic of our discussions this morning or today, is essentially I have learned how to accept pain. Pain was just part of life. Now, looking back on these things, they revised the Indian Act law that they'll no longer take children away from their families, their communities, and transport them to faraway places. And this is a law that's been around since 1887, that every child from the age of 5 to the age of 16 must attend these schools, Indian residential schools. This is contrary to the treaty that says that we are expecting schools to be built in our communities so that everybody's equal. But the Indian Act wasn't about that. It was about elimination of identity, including your languages, your worldview, everything that made you strong. Now, in 1970, they revised this Indian Act to allow parents, or grandparents in this case, to raise a child in their home. So here I was getting in trouble, essentially I was kicked out of the schools. And my grandparents says, I would love to have him. We'll raise him. And I was brought from the city into the community. Looking back, it was very traumatic because I thought like I did something wrong. I thought this is abandonment issues. That's how it stemmed. But when looking back was the greatest thing that could ever happen to me because I grew up with those values of a small community that looks after each other, knows how to survive. And the love was there, always. For my grandparents, they did not have a chance to raise their own children because the law says you got to hand them over. So my mother went to Pine Creek Indian residential schools. My uncles went. A lot of our people have to go there. And this is the first time my grandparents were now able to raise a child. So I am impacted by that history directly by witnessing those laws that took place for our people. So that's why when I come from that point of view, it's all those traditional values. And by the time I left to go into the world to make a living, that was in 1999 when I fully went to Winnipeg. I started the journey of working for all levels of government eventually. Because at that time, they didn't have a lot of people that had that knowledge of that history,
Right.
knowledge on the way of life of our community members, the impact of Indian residential schools. I was taught by my elders, this oral traditions, these history. So that was a leg up when working for government that are now shifting towards, this is 24 years ago, when they're now shifting towards that maybe we have to do something about the plight of Indigenous people. There was a societal shift because at urbanization, everybody's moving to the city. There's a competition for jobs. And the applications in those workplaces was coming lower and lower. So they need to change their ideas in terms of who's going to work for you. How do you maintain your business? And it was an obvious solution here, is Indigenous people need to participate fully in all aspects of government, all aspects of jobs, in order for even for society to shift and stay in prosperity. So I got busy.
I'm sure you did.
And I got to learn everything about the banking industry, profits, nonprofits, governments. So I gained a lot of experience when it came to diversity and equity. So I started off in the areas of equity. I says, okay, the equity law has been there since 1970s, but you didn't really do anything when it comes to Indigenous population in terms of giving them fair dealings, get them education, get them jobs. So my first role was to educate as a business plan to corporations why it's a good business to take this segment, a very young segment of the population. But later on, I shifted because there was such a tremendous need to get to know the Indigenous peoples. At the same time, our own people need to learn about their own history because they weren't taught this at schools. It was only in the last 15 years. The focus now is to introduce that as a curriculum in our schools. So that's where we are with it. So when you asked me the original question about contemporary, traditional, I am very much both.
Yeah. And I'm so happy to hear that story. I'm so glad that you were raised by your grandparents. How old were you when you went back to them and began your community training, if I can call it that?
I was 5 years old. And you know what? At that time, our ceremonies, our teachings wasn't there. Just how to survive onto the land. Later on, I was going to other communities and they're starting to build that up. Do ceremonies, and I started getting involved. So I was a health director in 94 when I started bringing those traditions back into our community. Sweat lodges, healing ways, and so forth. Because it was 1950 when the last time we had those things.
Wow.
And now it has grown.
Well, that brings up another question. We've talked a little bit about the colonization process and the residential schools. I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit or perhaps share a story of how this trauma of colonization impacted people on an individual level. Like clearly there was a decimation of culture. Traditions were swept away. But I know you also work as a healer. So I'm wondering if you could just give us a snapshot.
Yeah, the impact of that experiencing colonization and Indian Act policies, one of the saving grace was that impact did not affect my own community until after World War I, because nobody came to our area. We were left alone. But they started after World War I. There was municipal communities. Tourism was big in the United States to come into the isolated areas. So we had these Americans, hunters and fishermen coming in. They gave us jobs of guiding them. But now you had the church coming in. You had Roman Catholic Church coming in. Later on, a couple of decades later, you had the Pentecostal Church coming in. So these are two Christian groups that came to a small community of less than 400, and now they're pitting each other against each other in terms of which Bible is the correct Bible. So they're now coming to get the children, take them to Indian residential schools. So as I said earlier, we had a hereditary chiefs, and my great-grandfather, Aramas Nipanak, was the last one to have that hereditary system. So he died in 1950. So the Indian Act was now being imposed in our community. They'll no longer have our traditional governance. We're not going to have parliamentary, European design, Canadian design, Indian Act election, which is 3 years later. But looking back on it, talking to the elders, he was the last one that held them all back. Like he didn't want any interference. He was still practicing his traditional ways. He had his pipe. He had a sweat lodge. But all that left our community after he passed away. Even our medicine people went away. Now you asked about the impact of colonization. It started with the children.
Yeah.
If you want to take over any community, you might go after their warriors. You might go after their medicine people and their healers, or the women, or the elders. You might go after all parts of the community. But the one that had the tremendous impact that destroyed the spirit of any community is that if you take the children away.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And just what I remember about the Australian Indigenous people, it went on for generations, and they called the loss, those times when their children were being taken away, they called them stolen generations. And it took the heart out of people.
Yeah.
It was unfortunately very well calculated. And I can't even imagine not being able to raise your own children. That would be just so devastating.
Just to imagine a community might have babies, whose babies going to grow up and they'll have to grow up sometimes at the age of 4, be taken away. Now what's left behind is devastation, the shame. Like men are powerless. Warrior societies are now powerless because they created a penitentiary here in Winnipeg just a few years after the Indian Act was brought up. And they needed to take those that violated these laws. So the first occupants were chiefs that didn't hold their people in line, as they say. If you were a father that didn't want to have your little daughter named Mary to be taken away by a priest in the RCMP, which is our police here in Canada, and he says you're not taking her, they get arrested for 4 to 6 months hard labor working in the quarry at the Stony Mountain Penitentiary. So that was existed since 1878, and it still exists with 80% of population is Indigenous.
Wow.
Yeah, from that colonization to be ripped away. Now, a child who only speaks Anishinaabe or Ojibwe or Cree, for that matter, or other language community you come from, imagine a 4-year-old girl named Mary, and Ojibwe is the only thing that she knows. And they're punishing her from immediately. They're cutting her hair, they're taking away her garments, her beautiful beatery that was given to her, and her blanket, and all that was thrown in the garbage. And then you get deloused. You get forcefully washed down. And then you're told to stay quiet. And a little child only knows what to do is to cry. So now you're seeing at the beginning of a traumatic event from lost innocence. And then you go through life to not talk about it because you're now, these establishments, these hidden residential schools are run by religious group. In our case, in our community, it's Roman Catholic, which is the largest group in Canada that ran these places. And the one thing you never do is say anything bad about the church. Even if something bad happens, you cannot speak about it.
And we know that bad things did happen. It's all coming to light. And I can only imagine the emotions, like going back to the community leaders that were sent to jail, the elders, the tribal chiefs. I can only imagine, I'm guessing, anger, shame, frustration, and with the little children, like confusion, abandonment issues.
Yeah.
Yeah, shame. What have you found the predominant emotions are that can emerge? Because I understand emotions were suppressed too as a coping strategy.
Yeah. And just before I answer that, my community was a little buffered for a little while because it's within 100 years of our memory. But this was going on for 3 generations. And it's only been recently because the last Indian residential school was closed down in 1997. So this is not ancient past. We're talking about people like myself who went to Indian residential school. I'm 3 generations, but others are 4 or 5 generations. Now, as a historian, they don't teach any of this stuff at schools. They don't talk about the Indian residential schools. They don't talk about the Indian Act. You don't even talk about treaties, and yet it's such a beautiful story. How did Canada become a country? Now, when I was for a while talking about the big picture, the impact is this worldview, the impact of what happened to our community, our society. And then I'm wondering the big split. The big split was after treaties, then this really split apart for a long time. And then after World War I, World War II, we contributed in safeguarding our own lands and our own countries. Because the one thing they can't stop us from doing is protecting our own lands. So after World War II, things changed because Canada is one of the founding fathers of the United Nations. And Canada was also involved in the Geneva Code on Genocide. Let's prevent this happening in the world. But the thing is, in the backyard of Canada, Indian residential school policies, Indian Act policies was still there. There was still segregation. So there was that tremendous pressure to say we got to clean up our act. So in 1951, they revised the Indian Act to allow freedoms to now leave your reserve, because before you needed a pass just to leave, and you weren't going to get it. But now you could go into the city, look for work, participate like anybody else. But they still keep the Indian Act because, for one, the Indian Act says we are supposed to share this country, and we decided to make you wards of Canada. Even to this day, I'm still a ward of Canada. I'm not totally free. But they owe us half of the wealth of the country. So that's why they don't want to get rid of the Indian Act. And 2 years from now, it'll be 150th year of the Indian Act. There is no other race legislation in the world, but Canada has one. But the changes were slow by fighting for your own rights and your freedom since the 50s. And then to be recognized in 1970 as that we are part of Canada. They're slowly letting out information to a point where 10 years ago, there's a Truth and Reconciliation Commission that says, here's a 94 calls of action for all Canadians, a mandate, national mandate, that you got to know this history. You got to know about Indigenous people and who they are. So to get back to that, how the impact of that colonization through trauma started a long time ago is intergenerational impact. Now, to finally start addressing it, because my focus was the big picture, history, why did it happen? What was the mindset? I got to understand the motivation. Nelson Mandela, when he came out of 27 years of hard labor, had no revenge in his heart. He says, we all have to work at this together. So he came up with truth, reconciliation, and healing. This is the healing component that Canada has left out. We're still in the truth and reconciliation period, but they gave a little bit of pittance, a little bit of funding to address that healing, that trauma. At the time, they never called it trauma, but it was really post-traumatic stress syndrome. And it's rampant. It's everywhere. We just got so used to it. Canadians got used to it. But our own people got so used to it. We're just starting to address it in the last 20 years, 15 years.
Definitely.
Now it's a big thing. Now it's about focusing on the individual. And I just want to say that I shifted from a worldview to have a more impact in how to address trauma is the person in front of you.
Very well said. Thank you. Thank you. And I'm thinking addressing it is all well and good. And I'm so glad you're doing the work you're doing, but we need you to replicate yourself so that there are many other people with your unique skills, which I understand are not readily available to do this work. But I'm thinking of people today in mixed societies. The trauma carries on, doesn't it? There are unthinking or hurtful comments. I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit to how the trauma continues when Indigenous people encounter non-Indigenous people in this country.
Speaking more closely to home, how this impacts my community today, we're not the same people we were 25 years ago, because we have grown now to be 1,500 in population. But we have this thing called lateral violence, and I'm trying to counter it with teachings and to look at it as lateral kindness, because we have our strengths, but don't let this colonization and its impact define who we are today. Now, I want to speak about compassion inquiry because I think it's the greatest approach to this. Because Anishinaabe, it means that we're people of a good heart. And what we do is we are part of that beautiful environment with Mother Earth, Imamaki. We're just part of it. We're not over it. We're not above it. We're part of it. And that's where the compassion comes from. That spirit of it all is in your heart. So in our ceremonies, it's all about our heart. It's about helping others. So I went on and learned about different techniques I went to search for spirit, energy medicine, shamanic work. And then I went and started working for a child welfare agency, West Region CFS, which is a large group that are taking now compassion inquiry. That's where the link is. And I'm there that we have a chance to change colonial laws to reflect our needs and our protocol, our ceremonial view, that the child is the center of our universe. other than reinforcement
Yeah.
when something goes wrong.
His Gabor often talks about how Indigenous communities model some of the best parenting he's ever seen in the world.
Yeah.
Two perspectives on that. It was absolutely criminal to remove children from such a rich parenting environment. So I wonder if I could ask you a little bit about, as we know in compassionate inquiry, the body keeps the score.
Yeah.
And the body says no. I looked up some health statistics from the Alberta Health Services that compared Indigenous communities, people in Indigenous communities, and people in non-Indigenous populations. And they're very grim. I'll just give you a couple of examples and I'll ask you to speak to them. Life expectancy. The life expectancy of men, Indigenous men, is 8.9, almost 10 years shorter than non-Indigenous men. With women, it's 9.6 years shorter. So it's even worse with women. And overall, this was in Alberta, they said the life expectancy is 14 years shorter for Indigenous people than non-Indigenous populations. Infant mortality is 2 times higher. Heart disease rates are 50% higher. Death rate from stroke, twice as high. The rate of tuberculosis, 44 times higher. The rate of type 2 diabetes, 4 times higher. And when we get to the suicide rates, it's absolutely horrendous. So, when the body is speaking in this way, speaking to the trauma, I wonder if you'd like to comment about that.
Yeah. When people come and ask me for healing, it's usually at a desperate state. They tried it out. They heard the bad news from the doctor. You're giving all kinds of medication. And now they're open to try maybe from an Indigenous healer. Good. You're now coming through the door. And I always found that 90% of the healing is always in the mind. Because that's where the source, where things went wrong. That's what your body doesn't think for itself. It responds to the mind. So what is the mind thinking? What is the mind going through? So I always says, look, we're gonna clean this up. We're gonna go work with what is the turmoil, what's going on with your mind. Because now you're gonna give your body a chance to heal.
But they come to you and it's a last-ditch effort. They've been diagnosed.
Yeah.
That doesn't give you a lot of scope to work with.
But it's not impossible.
I'd love to hear about that. Can you share an example?
I'll give you an example. Even my own wife had breast cancer. It was on the left-hand side. Now she looks after herself, live a good life in terms of good family background. But knowing what I know, something was manifested. So we said, okay, as soon as she found out this happened, she's crying. And I says, what's going on? And she says, I was told I have cancer. So right away, I knew that the first thing you got to do is address the fear, because her fear is bombarded with saying, I'm going to die now. This is it. So I had my network. So of course, I says, we're going to go see my friend who's a medicine man who knows how to deal with this stuff. And he was like a 2-hour drive away. And he said it was available. So I took her. Because I know for a fact that she needs to know that we can do things. Because I told her we'll work with the medical system, but we have our way. So we did ceremonies that she was given medicine. It needs to be done. Now I was still going to work because I want her to not have that fear, because fear will shut you down. Disease will spread. So as she was going through the system, chemotherapy it was easy for her because I would use energy work for her to not feel the draining of her energy. But what really hit home was now I have to focus on what's the background here. So it was a combination of hypnotherapy, Reiki, put her on a table, and I worked with her ancestors, and we worked together while I was working on the body, healing the body. I took her to a place of healing. Her ancestors were there. Anyway, after it was said and done, and now it's time for reflection, I says, how was that for you? She said, I'm going to be okay. I'm going to be all right. Her grandmother showed up and says, we did the healing for you. You're going to be fine. But she said, tell him. Tell your husband. And then I says, what do you have to tell me? At that time, we had our first grandson. and later on another grandson. We're saving up for this place that I have today. So I'm very strict with the spending. And now, being grandmother, she wants to spoil her grandchild. So we activated one of those credit cards with the big limit and all that stuff. She maxed out, but she didn't know how to tell me because she knows I'll get upset. And then she didn't voice it or tell anybody about this. So it was manifesting. All this shame became a cancer.
Yeah. Oh, gosh.
And it grew. So I says, you know what? Money is just energy. We'll find the money. Next thing you know it, pay it off her credit card. Eliminate the fear of itself, but to know, I forgive you, but you got to forgive yourself. Once again, I go back to 90% of the healing it has to be addressed in your mind.
And I guess that's where compassionate inquiry comes in, because it focuses on the emotions, the root emotions, and sadness, fear, shame, lots of variations of those in the people that you work with.
And just to get to your question about statistics, it grows, but it doesn't come down. Why are we not improving? We have great medical care in Canada. Going back to it, if you were holding all that in, all that pain as a child, it was a nightmare. You even blocked it off for your own psyche protection, but not tell anybody about it, is that you are suffering. And then we got these terrible illness and disease because your body's telling you there's something is wrong here. There's turmoil. I was invited to a conference last week to talk to men. It was a men's healing gathering. And I'm just standing among them with my mic talking about our common experience. But men were shut down. They can't be warriors. And there was shame. This intergenerational impact, that hurt, that shame was carried over to the next generation. And I says, for you men who are lucky to have a spouse, a partner that listens to you or have the means to go and hear how this history and colonization and your own pain, your own trauma impacted you, congratulations, you're on a healing journey. But the majority of you here, young and old, you're not talking about shame. You're not talking about your emotions. You're not talking about your anger, which is the one thing that really is shown all the time. This mistrust, all this. I says, you got to get help. You got to bring that story out of you. It's your story. You're not a victim of it. That's just your journey. Once you look at it and release it, you become resilient. You keep the story, but you don't keep the energy. And what you have is now you become a wounded warrior. You're an effective warrior because you got the wounds to show for it, because you've been there. Now I'll help others.
And that speaks beautifully to one of the key questions in compassionate inquiry. Who did you tell? And I'm sure, I love hearing that you are encouraging people to talk to each other, to let it out, to share their stories. So important, as you've just illustrated. So thank you for that. And I want to just reference something. When I was looking at your website, you have learned so many different healing modalities and your healing bundles. I'm curious, do you pull whatever from the modalities that you've learned from working with the ancestors? Is that something that you do on an individual basis when you work with people?
Altogether, what is the common denominator? Is spirit.
Yeah.
All modalities are just as equal to each other when it comes to healing. But it's a different process. It's a different approach to things. But it's still the same spirit. So for me, I call them bundles because they're around me. And I'm not sure which one I'm going to use. I might use a combination of both or a few of them. So when a person sits in front of me, I'm connecting to them from my heart, my essence, my intuition. What would help here? So I have my own spirit guides that says, can work with their spirit guides and saying, what approach do we need to do here? See, they might come very specific, but it's just like compassionate inquiry when you're asking, what is your intention? Same process. But I asked them to bring tobacco Because tobacco for us is permission to get past their free will. You're actually giving me permission now to go where we need to go. So it's the same thing with compassion inquiry. You wanted to get them from be heady, and then you do that breath exercise and other techniques. We bring them down to their heart. Now you make the heart-to-heart connection. Yeah, even in that moment, I don't know how I'm going to approach it. So for me, with compassion inquiry, it encompasses most of that what we're talking about, because we're going to the loss of innocence, we're going to the inner child, we're going to what's impacting them the most. And a lot of it is post-traumatic stress. A lot of it is that feelings. So it's the process from coming here to here is how we do our best we can. So when you've seen all that background, I'm still like, even Dr. Gabor Mate, he's always searching for the next piece to add on. And I can really relate to him. And when he came and worked for our people on the streets of Vancouver and get to understand the impact of colonization and what's impacting him today. And he's shifted towards compassion, the heart of it all, the spirit of it. And he's on that journey. Meanwhile, I'm on the spiritual side on that journey, learning about therapy. I didn't know I was supposed to learn more about talk therapy, but the thing is, it has its balance to now able to break it down and teach it. But there's so much similarities when it comes to spirituality. And in the end, it always comes down to that spirit.
Absolutely. And I had a question for you, which you've already answered, about why compassionate inquiry is landing so well in the Indigenous healing circles and Gabor's work. You've already covered that off. I go back to another question, and this is a big picture question. From your perspective, what will it take to truly heal the trauma that's rooted in colonial oppression? And obviously storytelling, work on yourself, recognizing the role of emotions, the role of spirit. But within the descendants of the colonizers, how can we contribute to the healing that needs to be done?
You see, we are bringing back our identity. We're bringing back all the things that we lost through colonial laws and changing our core beliefs. Now, we have to reflect on this. That's part of the healing journeys, reflect on this. We are showing ourselves out there by wearing our ribbon shirts. They've got their ribbon skirts. We are in the open. We are proud of who we are. We survived it. They even use the word surviving. We survived the storm. We survived it. We're still here. That rediscovery, that resiliency is starting to become more and more. And what's really helping is Canadian societies are joining us in this healing journey for all of us. As we have those orange shirts that every child matters, that movement. The other movement is to remember the missing and murdered Indigenous women and men. There's an image of the red dress. This is now starting to be where we're supposed to be in reconciling our past together. But the healing still needs to be done.
Yeah.
It's not enough healing to be done. We got to do more and more of it to help each other, to have these healing lodges and healing programs for all of us. And I created my own lodge, the Healing Lodge, in the last 3 years, so that other healers can come and learn new techniques and they go back to their communities and apply it. Because it's not just a Western treatment center kind of approach. It's overall how we have all these ancient teachings that's going to help us get there. Our mind, body, and spirit and emotions. So to answer your question in terms of how can we reverse this, it's going to be a while, but the best approach is that we're going to have our own people doing it for ourselves. Before it was, you had to get the service from somewhere and they come in. No. Our own people are healers, and we're going to reestablish our ancestors' role as healers. And in order to break this vicious cycle is to heal our ancestors of what they went through. But we got to heal ourselves and not lose the fact that the next generations will not have to feel that pain of what we or our ancestors went. We break the cycle. So the children to come will never have to know that.
And you've just painted a picture, and I'm going to check in and make sure I understand correctly. It's very much what Resmaa Menakem says in his book, In My Grandmother's Hands. And he uses the term like white-skinned, black-skinned, brown-skinned. People of the same skin color need to do their own healing first before integrating with people of other skin colors. But what you're suggesting does support that. You've got to do a certain amount of healing yourself, but there's also the education and the dialogue with people from other backgrounds. For example, between the Indigenous people and the descendants of the colonizing force. There needs to be more knowledge and awareness of exactly what's gone on, because I imagine just as there's anger and shame in the Indigenous population, there's tremendous guilt in the colonizing population, the descendants of the colonizers. And that can shut people down. They won't feel worthy. They won't want to interact and connect. So did I understand that roughly correctly?
Yeah. The first part is that we need to heal our own families, our own communities, ourselves as a group. I don't go that approach. My approach is original origin stories of the 4 colors that went into the four parts of the garden. But they came from the source of it all. And it was good, beautiful. And this is where the narrative comes in. The creator was lonely. So he created another part of itself, of creation, which is a masculine, feminine energy. That started another process from a big bang to a second bang, which is that we are the children of this creation. And that's the spirit. That's the one that blasted out and everywhere, all different dimensions, galaxies, planets, and so forth, including the one on Earth. There was these 4 that started going to their places. The creator wanted diversity. He didn't want everything to be the same. If you look at our planet, everything's diversity. Why not the people? Not just because we're different from each other, is to know that what's common about us is that we're that blue flame, that burst that went out. Is this that the creator says, I'm going to give you a place over there. There's desert over there. I want to give you where the mountains are. I want to send you to the oceans. I want to send you to the far north. I want to send you to challenging places or paradise. And in the end, there's going to be so much diversity that the creator would learn through all this, through your experience, including the life that is good, the bad, the ugly, or the blessings. But in the end, to appreciate diversity, to appreciate the garden itself, to know that we're all one. That is the image. That is the vision that our ancestors had. It's in our 7 fires prophecies about these events that talks about a choice of embracing our diversity, but not look at our differences and to be separated. So it's going to be the same old life about materialism and individualism. That's a choice. Or what about a choice of oneness, saying that we are all one? Ain't that what's going on today? We have a lot of people who are non-Indigenous coming to our ceremonies now because they're seeking answers. They're coming to the Sundance. They're looking for their own healing. And what becomes the common denominator in all our teachings, all of us, is spirit, love. And we want a better place for all of us.
Beautifully said. Thank you, Allen. Thank you. I'm going to wrap up just by quoting something I saw on your website, because this whole conversation has illustrated it beautifully. Your headline, I think, on your homepage talks about embracing the journey of bridging traditional and contemporary worlds for holistic wellness and historical cultural awareness. So bravo, you've been doing an amazing job the whole time we've been talking of embodying that. And what I'd like to ask before we close today is for you to have your last say. You've got the stage. You've got the opportunity to whisper something in the ear of all of our listeners, something to leave them with, to ponder perhaps, or to take action on, what would you like to say to everyone who's listening today?
Maybe this one last teaching. There's always a teaching. But I use this teaching to talk about what is life, what is energy, what is spirit, what is manadu. And we went through these stages where a lot of it was core belief systems, a core understanding. And that could be limiting. But to evolve to a next level is to say there is no limit. And some will even go as far as saying sky's the limit. That's a limitation. So a lot are now in that second, we call it the fourth world, a transitional, a cocoon state. Some will call it spirituality. But the third part is, it's not necessarily a spiritual understanding. There's a third part of it as you evolved. Most of humanity is going through it, like it or not. So you're in a soup. Some are easy to go through this because they see it more as a blessing. Then something says, what's going on here? And I get phone calls all the time. What's going on here? Because you get pain. This is, you're getting downloads. You're shifting evolution of your soul. That's basically, you're getting rid of all stuff that you don't need anymore. And 2025, like, it's still going to be like the birthing period. Get ready for that. But your gifts are there too. So from a caterpillar to a cocoon, you become a butterfly. And then you got a divine intelligence where there's no limit, but just to know who you are. You're awakened to the fact that you always was a butterfly. I'll leave it as that.
Allen Sutherland, thank you so much for your time and the wisdom you've shared with us today. It's been an absolute treat to have you as our guest on the Gifts of Trauma podcast.
It's my pleasure to share this space with you. Miigwech.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
If you're not a therapist or a healer, but you heard our guest describe the personal transformations they experienced during their compassionate inquiry journeys and wonder, what might that be like for me? There is a program that is offered to anyone who wants to experience the power of Gabor Mate's approach to trauma healing. I'm Kevin Young, and I've been facilitating CI circles since 2022. I've seen people transform in many ways. I've seen people change beliefs, relationships. I've seen people change how they show up in the world. I have seen people literally change how they look in front of my very eyes. There are many, many ways that people change during compassionate inquiry circles. Circles is a 10-week small group experience, and registrations are opened until January 26th. Click the link in the show notes. That'll bring you to a web page that gives you all you'll need to figure out if this is for you.
The Gifts of Trauma is a weekly podcast that features personal stories of trauma healing, transformation, and the gifts revealed on the path to authenticity. Please note, this podcast is for informational purposes only. It is not a substitute for personal therapy or a DIY formula for self-therapy.